The wind in Dry Willow, Wyoming territory, had a taste. It was not the clean, sharp bite of mountain air, but a gritty flavor of red dust, salt cedar, and the vast, aching loneliness of the prairie. In the late autumn of the 1880s, that wind carried the first whisper of winter, a cold promise that made the clang of the blacksmith's hammer seem a little more urgent and the whistles of the distant, approaching railroad sound like a cry from another world. Nora Daly felt the wind tug at the heavy braid of dark hair coiled at her nape as she stood at the edge of the crowd in the stockyards. She kept one hand resting on the smooth, cool curve of the earthenware crock she held cradled against her chest. Inside, her sourdough starter, a living inheritance from her mother, bubbled slow and quiet, a patient heart beating against her own. At 28, Nora was a woman built of the same sturdy substance as her bread solid, resilient, and more complex than a passing glance would suggest. Her dream was simple enough to sketch on a dusty plank a small diner and bakery, a place with a tight roof and a floor that could be swept clean. But beneath that was a deeper hunger, a need to be seen for the skill in her hands and not the space she occupied. The auctioneer's voice was a frantic rattle, trying to wring coin from a crowd of ranchers and cowboys whose pockets were as dusty as the land. Nora's attention was fixed on a single item, pushed to the side like an afterthought, a derelict chuck wagon. Its canvas was torn. One wheel sat at a miserable angle, and the wood of the chuck box was splintered and gray. It was a skeleton, but Nora saw the bones and knew she could put meat on them. A few yards away, Eli Cutter leaned against a corral post, his hat tipped low. At 33, he was the foreman of Coyote Ridge Ranch, a man who had the stillness of the plains in his eyes. He'd learned quiet from the land and patience from watching things grow or die. A failed harvest and a biting bank loan from his younger years had taught him the difference between justice and the law. He watched the proceedings without comment, his gaze moving from the cattle to the faces in the crowd, assessing value in all its forms. His gloved hand rested near the coiled rawhide lariat at his hip, a tool of his trade, braided with a precision that spoke of a disciplined mind. Near the front, standing beside her father, the town banker, was Prudence Vale. Her dress was immaculate, a stark blue against the dun-colored landscape, and her face was a polite, carefully constructed mask. Prudence believed the world was a ledger, and a person's worth could be tallied by their figure and their finances. Her gaze had once lingered on Eli Cutter, seeing not the man but the foreman of a significant ranch, a potential asset in the social arithmetic of Dry Willow. Her assessment of Nora Daly, when her eyes flickered over her, was a quick, dismissive calculation that resulted in a negative sum. The auctioneer finally turned to the wagon. "All right, folks, what am I bid for this piece of authentic Western history, a fine traveling kitchen for a crew? Just needs a little love. Who'll start me at $5? A low chuckle rippled through the cowboys. "That thing needs a funeral, not a bid," someone muttered. $3. A rancher from the Double Horn outfit called out. A lazy, speculative offer. He needed a spare parts wagon, and its cook had recently quit. Nora's hand tightened on her crock. She had counted her savings a dozen times. It was not much, scraped together from selling pies and biscuits to passing freighters, but it was hers. $6, Nora said. Her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs. Heads turned, eyes widened, first with surprise, then with amusement. The Double Horn rancher frowned, annoyed at being challenged by a woman, especially this one. Prudence Vale raised a delicate eyebrow, a flicker of contempt in her expression. Eli Cutter shifted his weight, his gaze settling on Nora with a neutral, unreadable intensity. "7, the Double Horn man snapped back, his pride now invested. "10, Nora said immediately. A gasp went through the crowd. $10 was more than the wagon was worth in scrap. It was enough to signal she wanted it for more than parts. She was bidding on its purpose. The other ranchers spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, He looked from Nora's solid frame to the dilapidated wagon. A slow, malicious grin spread across his face. He understood now. It was a joke. He tipped his hat to her in mock gallantry and stepped back, his laughter joining the growing swell from the crowd. The auctioneer, sensing the shift, pointed a gavel at Nora. $10 from the lady. Do I hear 11 $10? Going once, going twice. He slammed the gavel down. Sold to Miss Daly for $10. As Nora stepped forward, the whispers grew louder, turning into open jeers. A lanky cowboy nudged his friend. What's she gonna do with a whole chuck wagon? His companion laughed, a harsh, braying sound. Buying a kitchen wagon to feed herself, I reckon. The insult, crude and public, struck Nora like a physical blow. It was a familiar pain, the old shame of taking up too much room in a world that prized scarcity. Her face burned, but she lifted her chin. She walked past the smirking faces, her back straight, and handed her carefully folded bills to the auctioneer's clerk. She did not look at any of them. She looked at the wanted poster for cattle rustlers tacked to the auctioneer's stand, at the bold print offering a reward. She looked at the way the wind whipped dust devils across the yard. She looked at anything but the judgment in their eyes. Eli watched her. He saw the blush that rose on her neck and the rigid set of her shoulders. He saw her ignore the laughter. He had seen men crumble under less. He pushed himself off the post and ambled over. Not to the wagon, but to the water trough, his movements unhurried. Prudence turned to her father. Well, that was a spectacle. Some people have no sense of proportion. Her voice was pitched just loud enough to carry a final, sharp stone cast at Nora's back. The town of Dry Willow, it was clear, measured a person first by the lines of their silhouette, and second by the contents of their wallet. After the crowd dispersed, Nora stood alone with her purchase. The wagon looked even more hopeless up close. The hinges on the chuck box were rusted solid, and a faint, sour smell of rot emanated from the rain-soaked wood. This was her grand investment, a pile of splinters and rust bought with mockery as its price. For a moment, her resolve wavered. The weight of the town's opinion pressed down on her. She took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. Then she set her crock down carefully in a patch of shade and got to work. She ran her hands over the warped wood, testing its strength. She kicked at the wobbly wheel, diagnosing the break in the axle. This she understood. This was tangible. A broken wagon could be fixed. A broken reputation was a harder thing to mend. That's a lot of work for a wagon. The voice was low and calm, startling her. She turned to see Eli Cutter standing a few feet away. He had a canteen in his hand, and his expression was impossible to read under the shadow of his hat brim. There was no pity in his eyes, but no amusement either. Only a quiet statement of fact. Nora straightened up, wiping a streak of dust from her cheek with the back of her hand. Work is the only thing that's free out here, Mr. Cutter. A corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. That it is. He gestured with his chin toward the broken wheel. Axles cracked. You'll need a blacksmith for that, and new canvas, before the first snow. I'm aware, she said, her tone clipped. She did not need a man to tell her what was broken. She had eyes. He did not seem offended. He simply nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment on the sourdough crock resting by the wagon. He recognized the care with which she had placed it, the way a person handles something precious. Then he looked back at her. Coyote Ridge might have need of a trail cook for a 10-day drive, if you can get this wagon rolling. The offer was unexpected. It was practical. It was business. It was also a lifeline. But the memory of the crowd's laughter was still fresh. To cook for a bunch of cowboys. To be the subject of their jokes and scrutiny around a campfire every night. I'll think on it, she said, turning back to the wagon, signaling the end of the conversation. Eli accepted the dismissal with another slight nod. He took a long drink from his canteen, then turned and walked away, his spurs leaving faint, rhythmic marks in the red dust. He was a man drowning in debt, the bank her father owned holding the note on his ranch. But Nora didn't know that. All she knew was that he hadn't laughed. And in Dry Willow, on that particular afternoon, that felt like a profound act of kindness. Alone again, Nora picked up her crock. She held its familiar weight, its living warmth a comfort against the chill of the day. The jeers had wounded her, but Eli's offer had planted a small, defiant seed of hope. She had a wagon. It was broken, but it was hers. And she had her starter, the promise of bread to come, in the vast, harsh landscape of Wyoming. That was enough to begin. The road to her diner was a long one, and it started right here, with one cracked axle and a town full of laughter she would have to learn to ignore. 3 days of grueling work and nearly all her savings had transformed the wagon. The blacksmith, a man with arms like tree trunks and a surprisingly gentle touch with iron, had mended the axle. Nora had spent 2 full days patching the canvas with tar and spare cloth, her fingers raw and aching. The chuck box hinges had been oiled until they moved with a reluctant groan instead of a scream. It was not a beautiful thing, but it was now a whole thing. It was hers, and it was ready to roll. She found Eli Cutter by the general store, reviewing a list with the deliberate focus of a man who could not afford mistakes. She waited until he looked up, her heart a heavy, rhythmic thump against her ribs. The 10-day drive meant cash, real cash, enough to buy flour for the winter and maybe a new set of cast-iron pots. It also meant 10 days of being the butt of a joke she had not written. "Mr. Cutter," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "About your offer, my wagon is trail ready." He folded his list and tucked it into his shirt pocket. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, assessed her for a long moment. The pay is $1 a day. You provide the food from the ranch stores. 10 days, maybe 12 if the weather turns. We leave at sunrise tomorrow. It was direct, practical, with no room for pleasantries. She appreciated that. "I have conditions." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, but he simply nodded. "Go on. Meal times are set by me. Breakfast before sunrise, dinner after sunset, a cold lunch in the middle. Portions are decided by me. I will not have men wasting food. And I require 2 barrels of clean water for the kitchen, separate from the trough water for the horses." He considered her terms. They were not unreasonable. They were professional. They were the demands of someone who knew her job, not a woman asking for favors. "Whoever runs the kitchen sets the rules," he said, the words a simple statement of fact that felt like a treaty. "Be at the east pasture by dawn." The deal was struck. As Nora turned to leave, a buggy rattled to a stop nearby. Prudence Vale sat holding the reins, her gloved hands perfectly still. She had overheard. A cold, tight smile touched her lips as she looked from Eli to Nora, her gaze lingering on Nora's solid form with clinical disdain. "Eli," Prudence said, her voice like honey laced with frost. "I was just on my way to tell you that I found a wonderful cook for your drive, a man from Cheyenne, very experienced." "The position is filled," Eli replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. He tipped his hat. "Miss Vale." He turned and walked away, leaving the 2 women in the dusty street. Prudence's smile vanished. Her eyes narrowed on Nora, a flicker of raw anger in their depths. "You will find," she said, her voice low and sharp, "that the men of Coyote Ridge have particular tastes. I do hope you can keep up." It was not a hope. It was a threat. Prudence Vale, accustomed to arranging the world to her liking, had been thwarted, and she had chosen her target. Nora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Later that day, as she was loading the last of her personal supplies, a heavy sack of flour proved awkward. She hoisted it, grunting with the effort, trying to swing it up into the wagon bed. "Here," Eli's voice came from just behind her. He did not take the sack from her. Instead, he placed his hands under it, sharing the load, his presence a solid warmth at her back. He did not comment on her strength or her struggle. He simply asked, "Which shoulder carries better?" The question was so unexpected, so practical. It disarmed her completely. "The left," she murmured, and together they maneuvered the heavy sack into place. He stepped back without another word, leaving her with the faint scent of leather and dust and a strange, unsettling feeling of having been seen not as a shape, but as a worker. Before leaving town, Nora sought out one last person. Tiva was a Shoshone woman who sometimes came to the edge of Dry Willow to sell herbs and beadwork. Nora found her sitting under a cottonwood tree, her hands moving deftly as she worked a piece of leather. "I need something for the trail," Nora said, foregoing a greeting. Tiva appreciated directness. The older woman looked up, her dark eyes seeming to understand more than was said. She reached into a pouch and pulled out a small bundle of dried leaves tied with sinew. "Sage," she said, "for when the wind howls and the fire spits, you burn a little. The kitchen will be brave." Nora paid her and tucked the bundle into her apron. The clean, sharp scent of the sage was a comfort, a small piece of wild magic to take with her into the territory of men. The first evening on the trail, the campfire was an island of light in a vast, dark ocean of prairie. The cattle were a restless, murmuring shadow. The cowboys ate in silence, hunched over their plates, their hunger a raw, animal thing. Nora had made a thick beef stew, heavy with potatoes and onions, and a batch of skillet cornbread, its crust crisp and golden. A big, barrel-chested wrangler named Silas, who had been drinking from a hidden flask since they made camp, swaggered over to the fire. He held out his empty plate. "More?" he grunted. Nora ladled another portion onto his plate. He stared at it, then looked her up and down. A slow, insolent appraisal. A smirk spread across his face. "With a cook your size," he slurred, his voice loud enough for the whole camp to hear. "I'm surprised there's enough spoon to go around." The other men froze, their own spoons halfway to their mouths. The insult hung in the cold night air, ugly and sharp. Nora felt the familiar hot flush of shame rise up her neck. But then, something else rose with it, the memory of Prudence's threat, the scent of Tiva's sage, the simple, respectful weight of Eli's hands helping with the flour. She stood up straight, placing her hands on her hips. The firelight flickered across her determined face. She looked Silas directly in the eye, her own voice ringing with a surprising clarity. "Don't you worry about the spoons, cowboy," she said, her tone laced with a dry, dangerous humor. "I can handle this whole crew with nothing but this skillet." A stunned silence fell over the camp. Then, one of the younger cowboys, a boy named Lem, choked back a laugh. Another man chuckled. Silas, caught off guard by her directness and the ripple of amusement, flushed a deep red. He grumbled something under his breath and retreated to the shadows, defeated. From across the fire, Nora saw Eli Cutter watching her. He did not smile, but there was a faint glint of something in his eyes' approval. Perhaps he had let her fight her own battle, and she had won. The kitchen, for now, was hers. Later that night, when the camp was quiet and the men were wrapped in their bedrolls, Nora sat by the embers of the fire. She pulled a small, worn ledger from her things. By the faint red glow, she dipped a pencil stub in her mouth and wrote. The words of the wrangler still echoed in her mind, a splinter she could not quite dislodge. On the clean page, she wrote a thought that had been forming all day. Bread rises because it trusts the yeast. A person rises by trusting themselves. As she was closing the book, a shadow fell over her. It was Eli. He was holding a tin cup. "Coffee's good," he said. It was the highest praise a cowboy could give. "Thank you," she said, not looking up. He stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them. "Heard a rumor in town before we left," he said, his voice low. "A band of rustlers pushing south. The ones from the poster at the auction. Sheriff Rusk said it was just trail talk." Nora looked up then. She knew Rusk was a man who did whatever the bank, whatever Prudence's father wanted. "You do not believe him." Eli stared out into the darkness, toward the unseen. Sleeping herd. I believe in watching my own fences, he said. He took a sip of his coffee. Just thought you should know. A camp cook sees a lot. Keep your eyes open. He did not say anything more. He just finished his coffee and then disappeared back into the night. A silent foreman checking on his herd. His ranch. His world. Nora was left alone with the dying fire, the weight of her new job, and the unsettling knowledge that the jeers of a drunken cowboy might soon be the least of their problems. The vast, empty prairie suddenly felt a little less empty and a lot more dangerous. The days on the trail settled into a rhythm dictated by dust and distance. Each morning began in the frigid, blue-gray dark, with Nora moving like a phantom in the firelight, the smell of strong coffee and frying bacon her first words to the sleeping camp. The days were a long, slow grind under a vast, indifferent sky, the world reduced to the plodding hooves of the cattle, the constant cloud of red dust that coated every surface and worked its way into every mouthful of their cold midday meal of biscuits and jerky. Mosquitoes rose in whining clouds from any patch of damp earth. Evenings brought a bone-deep chill, the prairie stars seeming to crackle in the cold, clear air. Nora's chuck wagon became the heart of their small, moving world. She learned the landscape of her kitchen by feel, the exact location of the salt box, the heft of the flour sack, the familiar curve of her cast-iron skillet. Nothing was wasted. Beef tallow was rendered for frying. Coffee grounds were boiled a second time for a weaker, but still hot, morning drink, and stale biscuits were crumbled into stews. The men, who had first viewed her with suspicion, now watched her with a kind of quiet awe. Her cooking was not fancy, but it was honest and abundant. The memory of their laughter at the stockyards had been buried under an avalanche of cornbread, beans, and beef stews so rich it made a man forget the cold. She became a student of their appetites and their aversions. She learned that a wiry cowboy named Pete could not abide onions, and that young Lem, barely 16, had a sweet tooth he tried to hide. She noticed the way Silas, the man who had insulted her, would carefully pick every speck of chili pepper from his stew. She began setting aside a portion for him before adding the spice, a silent, unacknowledged gesture of truce. For Lem. She started baking a small batch of molasses cookies after the main dinner was done, leaving them on the chuck box for him to find during his lonely turn-at-night watch. She never mentioned it, and he never thanked her in words. But the next day, his shy "good morning" was a little brighter, his offer to fetch water a little quicker. Food was her language, and in these small acts, she was mending the frayed edges of their small community. One morning, a cowboy squinted into his tin mug, swirling the dark liquid within. "Miss Daly," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "This coffee is thick enough to float a horseshoe." Nora, who was scrubbing a pot with a fistful of sand, did not look up. "It is made thick enough to make a man think a decent thought before noon," she replied, her tone even. "Drink it." A few of the men laughed. A different kind of laughter from before. It was not at her expense, but with her. The gruff humor was a sign of acceptance, a shared language they were all beginning to learn. The kitchen had its rules, and its keeper had a wit as sharp as her butcher knife. On the 7th day, the sky turned a bruised greenish yellow. The air grew still and heavy. Eli rode up to the wagon, his horse skittish, its ears twitching. "Trouble coming," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Tie down what you can." The first hailstones were the size of beans, rattling against the canvas top of the wagon. Then they grew to the size of marbles, then acorns, hitting the hard earth with a sound like 1,000 tiny hammers. The cattle began to bawl and scatter, a tide of panicked bodies breaking against the riders who struggled to hold them. A sudden violent gust of wind slammed into the chuck wagon. It shuddered, tilted precariously, and with a great crash of iron and wood, the entire chuck box, with its precious cargo of pots, pans, and provisions, toppled into the mud. The fire hissed, nearly extinguished by the downpour of ice. Chaos erupted, but through it, Nora moved with a singular focus. The fire. The fire was everything. She grabbed a heavy canvas tarp and threw it over the sputtering embers, shielding them from the worst of the hail. "Hold this," she yelled. And Lem, his face pale, scrambled to obey. Eli was suddenly there, off his horse, his coiled rawhide lariat in his hand. He did not ask what she needed. He saw. He drove 2 stray iron stakes from the wagon into the muddy ground and, with a few deft movements, used his rope to rig the tarp into a crude but effective lean-to over the fire. Together, they knelt in the mud and hail, Nora carefully nursing the embers back to life while Eli held the tarp steady against the wind. All around them, men shouted and horses screamed, but in their small shelter, there was only the hiss of the fire and the ragged sound of their breathing. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind a battered landscape and a scattered herd. It took the rest of the day and half the night for the cowboys, soaked and exhausted, to round up the last of the stray cattle. When they finally straggled back into camp, they were met with the impossible. Glorious smell of hot coffee and the sight of Nora, her dress streaked with mud, serving up bowls of hot stew from a pot balanced on a makeshift rock hearth. A sense of shared survival, of having weathered the storm together, settled over the camp, warmer than any fire. During the roundup, Silas's horse had slipped in the mud and kicked out, its iron-shod hoof catching the big wrangler on the shin. He had limped back to camp, his face grim with pain, trying to hide the severity of the injury. Nora saw the blood soaking through his trousers. She approached him with a bucket of boiled water and a clean rag. "Let me see," she said, her voice gentle but firm. He started to protest, the old pride flaring in his eyes, but the pain was too great. He slumped onto a log and let her cut away the fabric. The gash was deep and ugly. Without a word of reproach, without any mention of his past cruelty. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly deft, and bound it tightly with strips of cloth torn from a spare flour sack. When she was done, she simply stood up and went back to her cooking. Silas watched her go, his expression a mixture of shame and a new, grudging respect. The world he understood was one of hard words and harder fists. This quiet, unconditional care was a language he was only just beginning to comprehend. The next day, as the wagon jolted over a particularly rough stretch of terrain, Nora heard a sickening crack from inside the chuck box. She stopped the mules at once and rushed to check. Her earthenware crock, the one that held her precious sourdough starter, had been thrown against a cast-iron pot. A spiderweb of cracks ran down its side, but miraculously, it had not broken completely. She lifted it out, her hands trembling slightly, and cradled it in her arms, holding it close to her chest. She stood there for a long moment, simply holding the cracked pot, her face a mask of worry. Eli, riding nearby, saw the whole thing. He saw the panic in her eyes, the fierce, protective way she held the crock. He did not say anything, did not offer any empty reassurances, but he watched, and in his gaze there was a deep, silent understanding. He saw that it was not just a pot of flour and water. It was the heart of her craft, a living piece of her past and the seed of her future. It was her resilience, held in a fragile, cracked container. A day from the ranch, they heard it, the lonely, mournful whistle of a train, a sound that spoke of a different world, a world of steel and speed that was encroaching on their own. Later, they shared a noon meal near a railroad construction camp. The laborers, a rough, brawny crew, shared rumors with the cowboys. They spoke of the bank in Dry Willow buying up land cheap, pressuring ranchers to sell parcels along the planned route. The name Vale was mentioned more than once. The railroad, which had seemed like a distant promise, now felt like a looming threat, another form of pressure on men like Eli who were already struggling to hold on. When they finally rode into the home pasture of Coyote Ridge, the 10 days stretched to 12. The men were exhausted, but the herd was intact. The drive was a success. Nora cleaned her wagon and presented her tally to Eli. He studied the paper, then looked up, his face grim. "The count is right," he said, "but the pay is not." He explained that the ranch's funds were tied up, a payment from a cattle sale delayed. He could only give her half of what she was owed. A cold knot of disappointment formed in Nora's stomach. She had counted on that money. She had earned it. "But I have another offer," he continued. Before she could protest, "The cook at the ranch house just quit. The job is yours. If you want it, a steady wage, room and board. I will see that you get the rest of what you are owed from your first month's pay." It was an offer born of desperation, both his and hers. To stay here, at Coyote Ridge, meant a roof over her head for the winter and a steady income. It meant a chance to build her savings for the diner. But it also meant staying in a place where she would be a permanent fixture, not just a passing cook, subject to the whims and judgments of a whole community of men. It meant putting her dream on hold just a little longer. She looked past him, at the sprawling ranch house, the bunkhouse, the corrals. It was a world of men, a world of work, but she had survived the trail. She had survived the storm. She had survived their judgment. She thought of her cracked sourdough crock, still alive, still bubbling, waiting to be fed. "I will take the job," Nora said, her voice clear, "on my own terms." The cookhouse at Coyote Ridge was not so much a kitchen as a place where food had occasionally surrendered. It was a long, low building of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud that had crumbled in a dozen places. It smelled of old grease, damp wool, and the pervasive, heavy scent of cattle that seeped in from the nearby barns. The man who had cooked there before Nora had left in a hurry, and his departure was written in the sticky residue on the countertops and the mountain of unwashed pots piled by the stone hearth. For Nora, this was not a disaster. It was a blank slate. She spent her first 2 days in a fury of cleaning, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, a kerchief tied over her hair. She scrubbed the tables with lye soap and sand until the pale grain of the wood reappeared. She boiled the pots clean, organized the pantry, and established a system, a ledger for rations, a hook for the keys, and most importantly, a massive iron kettle that was to be kept full of boiling water at all times, a luxury the men had never known. The cowboys, accustomed to a certain level of masculine squalor, watched her efforts with a mixture of suspicion and amusement. They were not used to a woman in this space, and they were certainly not used to one who moved with such quiet, unyielding authority. The grumbling started on the 3rd day. "Place smells like soap," one man complained, wrinkling his nose. She counted out the beans. Another whispered, "Counted them, like we are school children." Nora heard them. She said nothing. That evening, for dinner, she served a massive pot of beans, slow simmered all day with salt pork and molasses until they were thick and rich. Alongside it, she made skillet after skillet of cornbread, baked in bacon grease until the edges were a deep, crispy brown and the insides were fluffy and yellow. It was simple food, but it was made with a care and skill that bordered on alchemy. The men ate in a stunned, reverent silence. Second helpings were taken. Thirds were requested. The grumbling about soap and counted beans was forgotten, replaced by the contented scraping of spoons against bowls. Nora had answered their complaints not with words, but with a language they all understood perfectly. The kitchen was hers. A few nights later, Eli came in from a long ride. Hours after the other men had finished their dinner, he was soaked from a sudden sleet storm, his face etched with weariness. Nora had kept a plate for him by the fire, the stew still warm. He ate without speaking, the silence in the cookhouse a comfortable thing, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the sleet against the roof. When he was finished, he did not leave his plate on the table for her to collect, as all the other men did. Instead, he carried it to the large wash basin, picked up the bar of lye soap, and began to scrub it himself. Nora looked up from the table where she was mending a tear in a canvas sack, her needle stopping mid-stitch. She was so surprised she could not speak. Eli did not look at her. He just kept washing, his large, capable hands moving with a practiced efficiency. "It is a rule I have," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Whoever eats late, washes late." He rinsed the plate, dried it on a piece of sacking, and put it away on the shelf. Then he nodded to her. "Good night, Miss Daly." And he was gone, leaving Nora staring at the wash basin, a strange, warm feeling spreading through her chest. It was not kindness, not exactly. It was a form of justice, plain and simple. It was respect, and to Nora, it felt more valuable than any compliment. In the days that followed, a quiet understanding began to grow between them, built on small, unspoken gestures. One morning, as she wrestled a heavy crate of potatoes, he appeared at her side and lifted it onto the table as if it weighed nothing. He did not make a show of it. He just did it, and then went on his way. Another time, as she bent over the fire, the tie on her apron came loose. He reached out, his fingers brushing her back for a fleeting second as he retied it into a neat, firm bow. The touch was so brief, so matter-of-fact, yet it sent a jolt of awareness through her that left her flustered for an hour. She, in turn, found his riding gloves one afternoon, left on a fence post to dry. One of them had a long tear along the seam of the thumb. That night, by the light of her lantern, she took out her needle and thread and meticulously stitched the glove back together. Her small, neat stitches, a contrast to the worn, scarred leather. She left it on the table in the cookhouse, and the next morning, it was gone. He never mentioned it, but a few days later, she found a small, intricately carved wooden bird sitting on her windowsill, a silent thank you. Still, she kept a careful distance. The memory of the world's judgment was a wall she had built around herself, brick by painful brick, and she was not yet ready to let anyone look over it. One bright, cold afternoon, the sound of an elegant buggy arriving in the ranch yard brought all work to a halt. Prudence Vale, wrapped in a fur-trimmed cloak, stepped down, a vision of color and wealth against the muted browns of Coyote Ridge. She carried a large, cloth-wrapped bundle in her arms. She swept into the cookhouse as if she owned it, her eyes taking in every detail, her lips curved into a smile that did not reach them. "Nora," she said, her voice bright and brittle. "I was in Dry Willow and I saw these and simply had to get them for the ranch. A proper kitchen needs proper tools. After all." She unwrapped her bundle to reveal a set of brand-new, gleaming copper pots. They were beautiful and expensive and utterly impractical for the rough needs of a ranch cookhouse. They were a gift that was also an insult, a clear message that what Nora had was not good enough. "That is very generous of you, Miss Vale," Nora said, her voice carefully neutral. "Not at all," Prudence replied, running a gloved finger over the dusty countertop, leaving a clean streak. "Father and I are so invested in the success of Coyote Ridge. I was just speaking with Sheriff Rusk about it. We all want to see Eli succeed." The mention of the sheriff, the man who served her father's bank, was not accidental. It was a reminder of the power they held, the debt that hung over the ranch like a gathering storm. After Prudence left, leaving the gleaming pots like a challenge on the table, a new tension settled over the ranch. That night, the cattle were restless, their lowing uneasy in the dark. The next morning, Eli found a set of strange hoof prints at the far edge of the north pasture, the tracks of a shod horse where no ranch hand had been. He said nothing to the men, but a grim, watchful look settled in his eyes. He spent the next several days riding the perimeter of the ranch, his rifle resting easy in its scabbard, his mind working on a puzzle that had too many pieces. He suspected the rustlers were getting information, a helping hand from someone in town. A few days later, Nora had another visitor, this one unannounced and arriving on foot. It was Tiva. She carried a bundle of dried plants. She entered the cookhouse and sat at the table as if she had been invited, her presence a pool of stillness in the bustling room. "Winter is coming," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "The children get the fever when the cold bites." She pushed the bundle across the table. "This is willow bark and sagebrush. You boil them. It makes the fever sleep." Nora took the herbs, their earthy, medicinal scent filling the air. "Thank you," she said, her gratitude genuine. Tiva nodded. "A good cook knows more than salt and flour," she said. Then, as quietly as she had arrived, she was gone. Nora stored the herbs carefully, a piece of old, wild knowledge entrusted to her care. That evening, Nora lit the new storm lantern she had bought in town and hung it on a hook just outside the cookhouse door. It was a small thing, but to her, it was a declaration. As the sun set and the cold, dark prairie night descended, the lantern cast a steady, golden glow, a beacon of warmth and welcome. It was her way of saying that as long as this light was burning, there was a safe place here for anyone who was tired, or hungry, or lost. The cookhouse was becoming more than a place to eat. It was becoming the heart of the ranch. But the old pains had long shadows. One afternoon, as she kneaded a great trough of dough, two young ranch hands passed by the open door. They did not see her in the dim interior. "She sure can cook," one of them said. "Has to?" the other one replied with a snicker. "A hog cook has got to know her business." The casual cruelty of the word, hog cook, struck Nora with the force of a physical blow. Her hands stilled in the dough. All her hard work, all the respect she thought she had earned, vanished in that single, ugly word. She was still just a size, a shape, a joke. She did not confront them. She finished her work, her movements stiff, her face a hard mask. That night, long after the last cowboy had left and the lantern cast its lonely light into the darkness, she sat at her table and opened her ledger. The praise of the men was a fickle thing, a currency that could be spent as easily as it was earned. She could not build her house on such shifting ground. She dipped her pencil in her mouth, the graphite tasting of dust and resolve. "Do not rise for applause," she wrote, her letters firm and clear on the page. "Rise for your own yeast." The wind that night was a living thing. It came screaming off the plains, a wild, hungry beast of a wind that clawed at the roofs of the outbuildings and moaned in the eaves of the bunkhouse. It was a wind that sought out cracks and weaknesses, a wind that promised a hard winter. Nora, in the warm, bright sanctuary of her cookhouse, could hear it testing the stout logs of her walls, and she was grateful for the solidness of the shelter she had made her own. Suddenly, a sound tore through the howl of the wind, a sharp, violent crack like a giant bone snapping, followed by a splintering groan and the terrified bawling of calves. Every man in the bunkhouse was on his feet in an instant, but Nora was already at the door, her storm lantern in hand. The light cut a swinging, frantic path through the darkness, illuminating a scene of chaos. A corner of the calf shed, the one that faced the full force of the gale, had given way. A main support post had split, and the roof was sagging dangerously, threatening to collapse entirely on the small, panicked animals huddled inside. Eli was already there, shouting orders, his voice a low, commanding force against the shriek of the wind. Men ran with ropes and spare timbers, their faces grim in the flickering lantern light. "We have to brace it," Eli yelled, "before the whole thing comes down." He and another man, Pete, were trying to lever the sagging roof beam up with a long pole, their muscles straining, their boots slipping in the churned mud. But the weight was too much. The beam slipped, and the whole structure groaned in protest. Nora did not hesitate. She set her lantern down where it would cast the most light and grabbed a heavy, discarded fence post. She was not as tall as the men, but her strength was a low, centered thing, born of hoisting sacks of flour and wrestling with heavy iron pots. She wedged the end of the post under the splintered beam, planted her feet wide, and put her entire body into the effort. Now she grunted through clenched teeth. Her added strength was just enough. The beam lifted a precious few inches. Eli, seeing his chance, shoved a block of wood into the gap, securing it for a moment. He looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise and a dawning respect in the wild, dancing light. There was no time for words. The wind tore at them, trying to rip the roof from their grasp. For the next hour, they fought the storm. It was brutal, punishing work. Nora and Eli found themselves working side by side, a silent, efficient team. They wedged timbers, they hauled ropes, they strained against the immense, indifferent weight of the collapsing shed. The air was thick with the smell of wet hay, terrified animals, and their own sweat. Splinters dug into their hands, and the wind whipped straw and dust into their faces until their skin was raw. They moved together, anticipating each other's needs, a grunt or a nod their only communication. Finally, with a last mighty shove, they got the main brace into place. The structure groaned, settled, but held. It was a temporary, ugly fix, but it would last the night. They stood back, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The other men began the work of calming the calves and securing the rest of the shed. But Nora and Eli stood for a moment in the relative quiet, the wind still howling around them, but the immediate danger past. "Come on," Eli said, his voice hoarse. He picked up her lantern, its golden light seeming blessedly calm after the chaos. He did not ask. He just started walking toward the cookhouse, and she fell into step beside him, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. They did not go inside. They slumped down onto the top step of the cookhouse porch, their shoulders nearly touching, their bodies radiating a shared heat against the cold night. The lantern sat on the step below them, casting their long, weary shadows against the log wall. For a long time, they just sat, catching their breath, listening to the wind die down from a scream to a low, mournful sigh. Nora leaned her head back against the rough wood of the doorframe and closed her eyes. Every muscle in her body ached. She could feel a dozen small cuts and scrapes on her hands. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, a sense of having met a challenge head-on and not been found wanting. The silence stretched, comfortable and easy. It was Eli who finally broke it. "I have never seen a woman do what you just did," he said, his voice quiet, almost awed. It was a simple statement of fact, with no flattery in it. Nora opened her eyes, but did not look at him. She stared out into the darkness, at the way the lantern light seemed to push back the vast, empty blackness of the prairie. His words, meant as a compliment, landed on a place that was still raw from the insult she had overheard days before. Hog cook. The two words echoed in her mind, a cruel counterpoint to his praise. A ragged, shaky breath escaped her. "It is funny," she said, her voice so low he had to lean closer to hear. "All my life, I have been told I am too much, that I take up too much room, too loud, too big, too strong. It seems no matter where I go, the world is built a little too small." The confession, a thing she had held tight and secret for years, simply slipped out, loosened by exhaustion and the strange intimacy of the moment. It was the truest thing she had ever said to another person. Eli was silent for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her, and she braced herself for a kind platitude, a clumsy reassurance, anything that would try to smooth over the raw vulnerability she had just exposed. Instead, he moved. He shrugged out of his heavy wool coat, the one that always smelled faintly of leather and wood smoke and the clean scent of the wind. He leaned over and draped it gently around her shoulders. It was still warm from his body. It enveloped her, the sleeves too long, the shoulders broad, but it settled around her with a comforting weight. It did not feel tight or constricting. It felt right. He settled back, his arm now brushing against the thick wool of his own coat that she wore. He looked at her, his face serious in the golden light. Mocked for her size, he shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "You are the only one who ever fit my arms right." The words were so simple, so unexpected, so utterly sincere, that they struck her with the force of a physical blow. They bypassed the wall she had built around herself and went straight to the heart of her. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sudden. She did not know what to do with the feeling, this sudden, shocking sense of being seen, of being enough. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She laughed. It was a watery, choked sound, but it was a laugh nonetheless. She wiped at her eyes with the back of a dirty, splinter-filled hand. "Your arms must be measured to fit a cast-iron skillet. Then," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. The small, witty deflection was a shield, but it was also a bridge, a way to meet his sincerity without being overwhelmed by it. A slow smile spread across his face, the first real, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his weary, serious features, making him look younger. "Maybe they are," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, flat piece of braided rawhide, a spare piece from one of his lariats. He pressed it into her hand. It was smooth and cool to the touch, intricately woven. "In a herd," he said, his voice returning to its usual quiet cadence, "there are always a few that spook easy. They will bolt at a shadow, run at a sound. It is the steady ones that hold the herd together, the ones that are soft, but strong enough not to break." He looked at the rawhide in her palm. "That is what this is. Soft enough to bend, but stronger than rope." She closed her fingers around the braid, understanding his unspoken meaning. He was not just talking about leather. He was talking about her. "We should move slow," she whispered, not sure if she was talking about their work or something else entirely. "I only know one way to cook," he replied, his eyes holding hers, slow, on a medium flame. It was an agreement, a promise. He would not push. He would respect the boundaries she needed. And in that moment, Nora felt a small, tentative seed of trust begin to sprout in the barren ground of her heart. The stakes had suddenly, irrevocably been raised. Eli was no longer just a boss. He was a man she might be willing to risk her heart for. And Coyote Ridge was no longer just a job. It was a home she would fight to protect. He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet. The coat slipped, and he adjusted it back on her shoulders. "Any night the wind blows out that lantern," he said, nodding toward the steady flame, "I will wash dishes until morning." It was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. A promise not of flowers or poetry, but of shared work, of steadfastness, of showing up when things got dark. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He gave her shoulder a light, quick squeeze and then turned, walking back toward the bunkhouse, his tall frame swallowed by the darkness. Nora stood there for a long time, wrapped in the warmth of his coat. The braided rawhide clutched tight in her hand, for the first time in a very long time. She did not feel too big. She felt simply seen. She did not notice the flicker of movement at the far end of the fence line, near the road. A shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadow of a cottonwood tree. A figure who had been watching, listening, their face a pale, indistinct oval in the darkness. The figure lingered for another moment, then melted back into the night, carrying the intimacy they had just witnessed away with them. A stolen secret to be used as a weapon. The quiet intimacy that had settled between Nora and Eli was as fragile as a new sprout in hard soil. It lasted for 2 days, a period of shared, unspoken understanding that lived in the space between them as they worked. Then, on the 3rd day, the world tilted on its axis. It began with Pete, the wiry cowboy who disliked onions. He came back from the midday meal, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He complained of a bitter taste in his mouth and a sharp, cramping pain in his gut. Nora gave him a cup of strong peppermint tea, thinking he had just eaten something that disagreed with him. But an hour later, Silas, his leg now healing but his face a pasty gray, stumbled out of the bunkhouse, clutching his stomach and retching into the dust. By late afternoon, 4 more men were down, shivering with fever despite the mild day, their bodies racked with a violent sickness that left them weak and dehydrated. Panic, a cold and greasy thing, began to seep into the healthy men. Their eyes, full of fear and suspicion, turned toward the one place they all had in common, the cookhouse. Whispers started, ugly and sharp. It was the food. It had to be the food. The new cook, the woman. She had done something. Nora's mind raced. She knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that her food was clean. She was meticulous. Her standards of cleanliness a religion. It had to be something else. The water. She remembered Tiva's warning, her gift of herbs, the fever. She ran to the small storeroom where she kept her supplies and retrieved the bundle of willow bark and sagebrush. Her hands did not tremble. There was no time for fear. There was only work to be done. Just as she was setting a large pot of water to boil for the herbal remedy, a rider galloped into the ranch yard, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust. It was Sheriff Rusk. He dismounted with an air of grim authority, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He did not come alone. Prudence Vale's buggy was right behind him, though she remained seated, a concerned, yet somehow triumphant, observer. Cutter Rusk bellowed, striding toward the cookhouse. "I got a report of a sickness out here. Word in town is your kitchen is poisoning people." Eli met him on the porch, his body a solid, unmoving wall. "My men are sick. Rusk, I do not need you to tell me that." "I am shutting this place down," Rusk declared, gesturing toward Nora's kitchen. "It is a public menace. As sheriff, I have a duty to contain it." He looked past Eli, his eyes locking on Nora. "And as for damages, for the cost of a doctor from Cheyenne, the bank is prepared to be reasonable. A small sale of land from your north pasture should cover it. A gesture of goodwill." The trap was sprung. It was so blatant, so perfectly timed, that Nora could almost admire its cruel efficiency. The sickness was not just a tragedy. It was a tool, a lever to pry the land from Eli's grasp. But Nora would not be a pawn in their game. She stepped out onto the porch, her sleeves rolled up, her face resolute. She would not let them define her, or her kitchen. "No one has been poisoned by my food. Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the tension. She turned her back on him and walked into the center of the yard, with a strength born of fury. She hauled one of the heavy water barrels from her wagon and tipped it over, the water gushing into the dust. Then she dragged another, fresh barrel into its place. She took her largest kettle, the one she used for laundry, and placed it over a newly built fire right in the middle of the yard, where everyone could see. "From now on," she announced, her voice carrying to every man watching from the bunkhouse and the barn, "no one drinks water that has not been boiled. I will serve oatmeal and boiled beef stew. That is all. And anyone." She looked directly at the healthy, fearful cowboys. "Who does not see me boil the water with his own eyes, does not eat." It was a bold public declaration of her integrity. She was making the process transparent, undeniable. Eli stood on the porch, watching her, a look of profound trust on his face. He had placed his faith in her, and she was meeting the challenge head-on. Before Rusk could respond, the sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, seemed to collapse. The wind shifted, and a dark wall of clouds rolled in from the west with an unnatural speed. A clap of thunder, so loud it shook the ground, was followed by a sudden, torrential downpour. It was not rain, it was a solid, hissing wall of water that turned the dusty ranch yard into a sea of mud in seconds. A cry of alarm went up from the direction of the creek. The storm had created a flash flood. The creek, normally a placid ribbon of water, had swollen into a brown, roaring beast. It had jumped its banks and was pouring through the low-lying pasture where the new calves were kept. The small animals were being swept away, their terrified cries barely audible over the roar of the water. The men, sick and healthy alike, forgot their fear and their suspicion and ran to help. Nora and Eli were among the first. They saw young Lem, who had been trying to herd the calves to higher ground, get his foot caught between two rocks. He was trapped, the churning, debris-filled water rising around him, pulling at him with a deadly force. "The rope," Eli yelled, looking at Nora. She understood instantly. She ran to her wagon, heedless of the mud and the driving rain, and pulled out the rawhide lariat he had given her on the trail. It was strong and pliable, and she knew how to use it. She tied one end around the sturdy porch post of the cookhouse, while Eli tied the other around his waist. He waded into the flood, the rope his only lifeline. Nora and two other men on the porch acting as his anchor, their feet braced, their hands gripping the wet, slippery rawhide. He fought his way to the terrified boy. The current trying to rip him from his feet, he managed to free Lem's trapped foot and, with the boy clinging to his back, he began the slow, agonizing journey back. The men on the porch, with Nora at their head, hauling them in, hand over agonizing hand. They pulled them onto the porch just as a massive log, torn from the creek bank, swept through the very spot where Lem had been trapped. Soaked, shivering, and exhausted, they had saved the boy, but most of the calves were gone, a devastating loss for a ranch already on the brink. As the rain subsided, leaving behind a scene of wreckage, Prudence Vale's buggy, which had retreated to the shelter of the main barn, reappeared. She stepped out, her expression a mask of perfect sympathy. "Eli, you poor man," she cooed, walking toward him. "First sickness, and now this terrible flood. The bridge over the creek must be completely washed out. How will you get to town for supplies for a doctor?" She paused, letting the implication of their isolation sink in. Father would want to help, of course. He would be willing to extend a small loan, just enough to build a temporary bridge, as a gesture of community support. She smiled, a sweet, predatory smile. He would only ask for a little security. The cookhouse, perhaps, and the main barn, just a formality, until the loan is repaid. It was the final, elegant move in their trap. They had exploited a natural disaster to create a new need, and offered a solution that would give them control of the very heart of the ranch. Eli stood there, mud-spattered and weary, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He was cornered. Nora, standing beside him, her knuckles white as she wrung the water from her skirt, spoke, her voice low and clear. "Eli, do not sell the roof to stay dry for one night." Her words cut through his despair. She was right. This was not a rescue. It was a surrender. He looked at Prudence, his eyes cold. "Thank your father for the offer, Miss Vale. We will manage on our own." Later that day, after Prudence and the sheriff had gone, leaving a trail of threats and ultimatums behind them, Nora was examining the water barrel she had emptied. In the muddy dregs at the bottom, she found it a fine, white, crystalline powder. It was not dirt. It was alkali salt. She looked toward the pasture where the main water barrels were kept. In the mud, nearly washed away by the rain but still visible, was a set of narrow wheel tracks. They did not match the broad wheels of any of the ranch wagons. They looked very much like the tracks of Sheriff Rusk's official buggy. Then she remembered something else. A new sack of salt for the cattle lick had been delivered last week. The label had been torn. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Now, a cold, terrible certainty settled in her stomach. The water had not been contaminated by accident. It had been poisoned. That evening, as Nora was tending to the sick men, ladling her willow bark tea into tin cups, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Tiva, and behind her were three other Shoshone women. They carried bundles of herbs and entered the cookhouse as if they belonged there. They did not ask permission. They saw a need, and they came. They worked through the night, their quiet, competent presence a calming force in the chaotic bunkhouse. They brewed teas, they bathed feverish faces, they burned bundles of sage to cleanse the air. Nora worked alongside them, a silent partnership of old knowledge and new resolve. The cookhouse, her small domain, had opened its doors. It was no longer just a kitchen for ranch hands. It had become a sanctuary for anyone in need. Near dawn, Nora stood over a pot of oatmeal, stirring it in a slow, hypnotic circle. She was so tired she could barely stand, her body one great throbbing ache. She felt a presence behind her, a hand gently closing over hers on the handle of the spoon, sharing the small burden of the stirring. It was Eli. He did not speak. He just stood there, his warmth a solid, comforting presence at her back, his hand supporting hers. She looked up at him, and their eyes met through the rising steam from the pot. In that look, everything was said. Fear, gratitude, a shared and terrible understanding of what they were up to against. And something else, too. A deep, unwavering commitment that had been forged in crisis and tempered in the fire. Their love was no longer a secret, unspoken thing. It was there, visible in the steam-filled air between them, real and solid and undeniable. He finally let go of her hand and stepped back. His face was set, his eyes hard as flint. He had made a decision. "I am riding to Dry Willow at first light," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I am going to find Rusk." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "A debt can be paid, Sheriff. A man's honor cannot." The morning air in Dry Willow was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the metallic tang of an impending frost. The town square was not a square at all, but a wide, dusty street that served as the community's heart and its courtroom. It was here that reputations were made and broken with a word, a glance, a public verdict rendered long before any judge arrived. When Eli and Nora rode in, they were not alone. Behind their wagon, which Nora drove with a steady hand, rode Pete, Silas, and young Lem, their faces pale but determined. They were the first of the sick to be strong enough to ride, and their presence was a silent, powerful testimony. Eli rode at the head of their small procession, his face set like stone, his gaze fixed on the sheriff's office. They did not have to wait long. Sheriff Rusk emerged, his badge gleaming on his chest, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He was not expecting a confrontation. He was expecting a surrender. He held a piece of paper in his hand. "Cutter," he announced, his voice booming across the square. "For the benefit of the shopkeepers and ranchers who are now gathering to watch, I have here a legal order to quarantine the Coyote Ridge Cookhouse. For the safety of this community, it is to be closed, effective immediately." This was his first move, an attempt to frame the argument as a matter of public health, with himself as the town's protector. But Nora was ready. She climbed down from the wagon, her movements deliberate and sure. She did not look at the crowd. She looked directly at Rusk. "My cookhouse is not a danger to this community, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still morning air. "But the water you have been forcing us to use is—" From the back of the wagon, Pete and Silas began to unload 2 water barrels. They were identical in every way but one. They placed them side by side in the center of the dusty street. One was filled with clean, clear water, drawn that morning from the spring-fed creek Tiva had shown Nora, miles from the ranch. The other contained the murky, tainted water from the ranch's main supply. Nora dipped a clean tin cup into the second barrel and held it up. The sunlight caught the water, revealing a sickening, milky sheen. At the bottom of the cup, a fine, white powder had settled. "This is the water that made my men sick," she said. "It is tainted with alkali, but not from the ground. It was put there." She walked to the barrel and pointed to the heavy wooden lid. The lid of this barrel was pried open. You can see the marks from the crowbar right here. The fresh splinters in the wood were undeniable. And in the mud beside the barrels, before the rain washed them all away. "I found these." She held up a wide plank on which she had carefully preserved a section of mud. Embedded in it was a clear, narrow tire track. "It is from a buggy. Sheriff, not a ranch wagon. A buggy just like the one you drive." A murmur went through the crowd. This was more than just an accusation. This was evidence, methodical and clear. Rusk's face flushed a deep, angry red. "That is circumstantial nonsense. You cannot prove a thing." "I can—" The voice was quiet, but it held an authority that made everyone turn. Tiva stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, her face a timeless, unreadable mask. She looked not at Nora, but at the sheriff. I was gathering herbs by the creek 2 nights before the sickness. I saw a man by the water barrels. He was not a cowboy. He came in the sheriff's buggy. I saw him pour a white powder from a sack into the water. Rusk sputtered, his composure beginning to crack. She is a known vagrant. Her word means nothing. The buggy had red wheels. Another voice piped up, small but clear. Young Lem stepped forward, his fear warring with his resolve. The spokes were painted red. I saw it when the sheriff came to the ranch. I remember because I was thinking of painting my own wagon wheels the same color. All eyes turned to Rusk's buggy, parked in front of his office. The spokes of its wheels were, indeed, painted a distinctive, garish red. The trap was closing. It was then that Prudence Vale, who had been watching from the veranda of her father's bank, could no longer contain herself. Her plan, her elegant, cruel trap, was unraveling before the entire town. She swept down the steps, her face a mask of cold fury. "This is absurd," she declared, her voice sharp with privilege. "You are going to take the word of these people over your own sheriff. This is all a fabrication, a desperate attempt by this woman to cover up her own incompetence. She turned the full force of her venom on Nora. Look at her. Of course her kitchen is filthy. A woman of that size could not possibly be clean or disciplined. She is a glutton who poisons men with her own slovenliness. The insult, so personal and so public, was meant to be a killing blow, a final appeal to the town's ingrained prejudices. A wave of whispers rippled through the crowd. It was the old shame, the old judgment, laid bare for all to see. Nora felt a tremor of fear, not for her safety, but for her soul. This was the moment the world would decide who she was. But before she could speak, before she could defend herself, Eli moved. He stepped forward, taking his place beside her. He did not look at Prudence. He did not look at the sheriff. He looked at the faces of his own men, the ones who had worked with him, ridden with him, and who were now watching to see what he would do. Slowly, he removed his hat, a gesture of profound seriousness. "The woman you are speaking about," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight, "spent 2 days fighting a sickness that was meant to kill you. She tended to you when you were too weak to stand. She fought a flood to save that boy's life." He gestured toward Lem. "She has worked harder for this ranch, for all of you, than any person I have ever known." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I will not have her name spoken with anything but respect, and anyone." His gaze swept over the crowd, hard and unyielding. "Who chooses to mock the person who saved their life is free to collect their pay and leave Coyote Ridge today. You can have your job, or you can have your dignity. You cannot have both while working for me." A dead silence fell over the town square. It was a choice, laid bare, loyalty or prejudice, gratitude or cruelty. Then Pete stepped forward. He looked at Prudence, his face full of a quiet shame. "She saved my life," he said simply. He walked across the dusty space and stood behind Nora. Then Silas, his limp barely noticeable. "Followed mine too," he grunted, taking his place beside Pete. One by one, the other men from Coyote Ridge, the healthy and the recovering, crossed the invisible line in the dust and stood with their foreman and their cook. It was a silent, stunning rejection of the old order. Just then, the circuit judge, a stern, white-haired man named Harrison, who had arrived on the morning train, stepped out of the general store. He had heard everything. He looked at Rusk, his eyes cold with contempt. "Sheriff," he said, his voice the final, unassailable authority, "hand me your badge and the keys to your evidence locker. I believe we will find a certain sack of mislabeled salt inside." Rusk's face crumpled. His power, built on bluster and backed by the bank, had evaporated. Defeated. He unpinned his badge and let it fall into the judge's outstretched hand. Prudence stood frozen for a moment, her mask of civility shattered, her true ugly nature exposed to the entire town. She looked at the faces staring at her, no longer with deference, but with a dawning disgust. Without another word, she turned, her back ramrod straight, and walked toward the train station. Her escape from the town she could no longer rule. The whistle blew, a long, mournful sound. The sound of her departure. The social order of Dry Willow had just been rewritten. In the now quiet square, the crowd began to disperse, talking in low, excited murmurs. Nora stood amidst the barrels in the wagon, the plank of evidence still at her feet. She was trembling, not with fear, but with the overwhelming, terrifying, glorious feeling of being seen, of being vindicated. Eli came to her side. He did not touch her, not yet. He just stood there, a solid, reassuring presence. "You all right?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am," she whispered. He looked around the empty square, at the cookhouse wagon, at the small, loyal band of men who stood with them. He looked back at her, his face full of a deep, quiet emotion. "You stand here," he said, his voice thick with a feeling she could not name. "And you are the roof over all of us." She picked up her storm lantern from the wagon seat. The wind, which had been still, began to pick up again. A clean, cold wind that promised to blow the last of the town's sickness away. She struck a match and lit the wick. The flame caught, small at first, then growing to a steady, defiant glow. It did not flicker in the rising wind. It was a light that was stronger than rumors, brighter than insults. It was a light that would last. The ride back to Coyote Ridge was quiet. The silence was not the tense, watchful quiet of the trail, but a deep, weary peace, the kind that follows a fever that has finally broken. The wind, now a clean, brisk breeze, seemed to be sweeping the last of the bitterness from the land. The men rode with a new posture, their shoulders less slumped, their faces turned toward home. When they arrived, the ranch felt different, as if the air itself had cleared. The cookhouse, which had been a place of suspicion and fear only a day before, now stood as a solid, reassuring anchor in the center of the yard. Nora's storm lantern, which had burned through the night, still hung by the door, its glass smudged with soot but its purpose fulfilled. The reopening of the kitchen was not a grand affair. It was a return to a rhythm. Nora set a massive pot of water to boil on the fire, the first and most important rule of her new regime. The work of mending began not with words, but with the familiar, comforting tasks of chopping vegetables and kneading dough. The next morning, a wagon from Dry Willow rattled into the yard. It was driven by the general store owner, a man who had been in the crowd during the confrontation. He brought sacks of flour, beans, and a large tin of coffee. The town took up a collection, he said, his face a little sheepish as he avoided Nora's eyes. For the trouble. It was an apology, clumsy and indirect, but it was an apology nonetheless. More came after that. Small offerings left on the cookhouse porch. A bundle of late-season carrots from a farmer's wife, a jar of preserved peaches, a new, sharp butchering knife. Dry Willow was trying, in its own awkward way, to make amends, to restore the balance that had been so violently disrupted. The most profound apology, however, came from the men of Coyote Ridge themselves. A few evenings after their return, Silas, Pete, and young Lem approached the cookhouse after dinner. Silas, a man not given to speeches, held a flat cloth-wrapped package in his hands. He cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on his own boots. "Miss Daly," he began, his voice a low rumble of embarrassment. We are not men who are good with words, but we know right from wrong, and we were wrong." He held out the package. "This is from all of us." Nora took it, her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm. She unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a new canvas apron, clean and white. but it was the embroidery that made her breath catch in her throat, stitched in neat, careful block letters of dark blue thread were the words, "Keeper of the Ridge's Taste," beneath the words. Each man on the ranch, from Eli down to the youngest stable hand, had signed his name in the same blue thread. Some were neat, some were a barely legible scrawl, but they were all there. It was a flag of surrender and a treaty of peace, all in one. It was a recognition not of her size or her shape, but of her skill, her value. Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not the hot tears of shame. They were the warm, cleansing tears of acceptance. She looked at Silas, at his deeply flushed face, and for the first time, she saw not an antagonist, but just a man, flawed and proud and trying to do the right thing. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. "I will wear it with honor." News of the official justice came a week later. Judge Harrison had been as good as his word. Rusk was suspended, his position to be filled by a federal marshal until a new election could be held. An investigation had been opened into the practices of the Dry Willow Bank, and Mr. Vale was facing a level of scrutiny that his money and influence could not entirely deflect. The threat of foreclosure that had hung over Coyote Ridge like a vulture had vanished. Freed from the bank's predatory grip, Eli found a better solution. He met with the heads of 2 other local ranches, and together they formed a small cattlemen's cooperative, pooling their resources to secure a fair baillie, low-interest loan from a larger bank in Cheyenne. The debt was still there, a long road of hard work stretching before them, but it was now a manageable burden, not a death sentence. The ranch was safe. With the external threats removed, Nora turned her attention to the internal culture of her domain. She took a clean pine board and, with a piece of charcoal, carefully wrote out her new rules. The cookhouse rules: 1. Water will be boiled. 2. Hands will be washed. 3. Kind words will be spoken at the table. She nailed the board to the wall just inside the door, where no one could miss it. The men saw it, they read it, and no one said a word against it. The time for grumbling was over. They had seen what carelessness and cruelty could lead to. A new, quieter, more decent code of conduct was being written, and it was being written by their cook. One afternoon, Nora saw Tiva walking toward the ranch. She went out to meet her, her heart full of a gratitude that was too large for words. But Nora wanted to offer more than thanks. "Tiva," she said, gesturing to the fallow patch of ground behind the cookhouse, "I am a good cook, but I have no skill with growing things. The sun there is good. The soil is rich. I would be honored if you and the other women would make it your garden, for herbs, for whatever you wish to grow. The produce is yours, but I hope you would teach me what is good for healing." Tiva looked at the patch of earth, then back at Nora. A slow, rare smile touched her lips. "It is good soil," she said. "We will make it a wise garden." A few weeks later, to celebrate the first frost and the full recovery of the men, Nora and Tiva organized a harvest stew. It was an open invitation to the entire community, the ranchers and the townsfolk. The Shoshone women brought herbs from their new garden, and Nora cooked a massive kettle of stew, rich with beef and the vegetables the town had donated. People who had once stood on opposite sides of a dusty street now stood together, sharing a bowl and a bit of warmth against the coming winter. The knowledge of healing, they were all learning, was a thing to be shared. But while the community was healing, some of Nora's own wounds remained. They were old and deep, and they did not close so easily. One evening, as she was serving dinner, a young cowboy, new to the ranch, looked at her and said, with a shy, genuine smile, "You look real pretty tonight, Miss Daly." A cold shudder immediately fell over her heart. She could accept their praise for her cooking, her strength, her courage. She had earned those things. But a compliment on her appearance felt like a trick, a lie, a prelude to a joke. She believed she was capable. She did not, could not, yet believe she was lovely. "The stew is getting cold," she said. her voice clipped, turning away before he could see the confusion and pain in her eyes. Eli saw the exchange. He saw the flicker of her old hurt, the way she retreated behind her wall of competence. He said nothing. But later that night, after the dishes were done and she was sitting alone, rubbing her aching shoulders, he came and stood behind her. He did not speak. He just gently pushed her hands away and began to massage the tired, knotted muscles himself. His large, warm hands, knowing just where the ache was deepest. It was not a gesture of passion, but of deep, quiet care. It was a language she could understand, a truth her body could accept even when her mind could not. He was patient. He would prove his affection with his actions, day after day, until she finally believed him. The ranch settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. The lost calves were replaced with new stock. The mended corner of the shed stood strong. Every evening, the blue smoke from the cookhouse chimney rose into the twilight sky, a sign of life, of sustenance, of home, and often carried on the cold, clear air, was the sound of laughter coming from the wash basin, where the new ritual of shared work had taken root. One Saturday, Eli enlisted a few of the men and spent the day building a long, sloping roof extension over the cookhouse porch. It was a simple, sturdy structure that provided a wide, sheltered space, protected from the sun and the rain. "What is this for?" Nora asked. "Watching them work." "A classroom," Eli said, wiping sweat from his brow. "I have been watching you with Lem. You have a gift for teaching. It is time the younger hands learned that there is more to being a man than roping and riding. They need to learn how to feed themselves." That afternoon, Nora stood under the new awning and showed a clumsy but willing Lem how to properly knead dough, how to feel the life in it, how to respect the process. She saw the dream of her own diner, her own bakery, not as a distant, hazy thing, but as a seed she was already planting, right here. Later that night, in the quiet of her kitchen, she opened her ledger, but instead of writing down her thoughts, she began to write down her recipes. The stew that had quieted the grumblers, the cornbread baked in bacon grease, the molasses cookies that had comforted a lonely boy on night watch. She wrote them down in a clear, careful hand. She was the keeper of the taste, but the taste did not belong to her alone. It belonged to the future. She would write it all down, she decided, so that the hands that came after hers would not have to start from nothing. The mending was not just for the present. It was for all the days to come. The first sign of spring was not the budding of the cottonwoods or the return of the meadowlarks, but the sound of hammers at the edge of Coyote Ridge, on a small, flat piece of land that overlooked the main road to Dry Willow. A new structure began to take shape. It was not a barn or a bunkhouse. Eli, with a crew of his most skilled men, was building Nora's diner. He had presented the idea to her one morning as a simple, practical matter. "The railroad is coming," he had said, pointing toward the distant line of freshly laid track that now gleamed on the horizon. "They will build a siding here to load cattle, and a water tower. Men will be working, and working men get hungry." It was not a flight of fancy, but a business plan, grounded in the realities of their changing world. He had drawn up the plans himself on the back of a feed invoice, a simple, sturdy building with a long counter, a few tables, and a large stone hearth for a baker's oven. He had used the money from the cattlemen's cooperative loan not just to secure the ranch, but to invest in their future. Nora watched the walls go up, her heart a strange mixture of terror and elation. It was her dream, the one she had carried silently for years, being raised from the dust by the hands of the very men she had once feared. They worked with a cheerful efficiency, their respect for her now extending to the careful construction of her new domain. Young Lem, proving to be a surprisingly skilled carpenter, spent hours sanding the long pine countertop until it was as smooth as silk. Silas, the big wrangler, hoisted the main roof beams into place with a strength that was now a source of pride, not intimidation. By the time the autumn aspens turned the distant hills to gold, the building was finished, a sign. hand-painted by Nora in the same steady script she used for her recipes, hung above the door. It read, "The Iron Pot and Gentle Heart." It was a name that spoke of both her tools and her philosophy, of the strength and the care required to make a place of welcome in a hard land. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, purple shadows across the prairie, Eli asked her to walk with him to the new building. The air was crisp and smelled of wood smoke and curing hay. He had hung a half-dozen of their storm lanterns from the rafters of the new porch, and in their combined golden glow, the raw, new wood of the diner seemed to be alive, a beacon of warmth against the coming night. They stood on the porch for a moment, not speaking, just looking at the solid, tangible proof of their shared work. Nora ran her hand over the smooth, cool wood of the doorframe. "It is real," she whispered, her voice full of a quiet wonder. "We are real," Eli replied, his voice a low, serious rumble. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. He took both of her hands in his. They were rough, calloused hands, hands that knew the weight of an axe and the delicate touch required to soothe a nervous horse. "Nora," he began, and she saw a flicker of nervousness in his usually calm eyes. "I am not a man who has a way with pretty words. I do not have a fortune to offer, and the life I know is hard work from sunup to sundown." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple silver ring. It was not ornate. It was a plain band, but etched into its surface, so fine she had to look closely to see it, was a single stalk of wheat intertwined with the intricate pattern of a braided rawhide rope. He held it in his open palm, a humble offering in the lantern light. "I cannot promise you a big house or a life of ease," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. "But I can promise a solid roof over your head. I can promise clean dishes, and I can promise you a pair of hands that will always be there to wash them with you." It was the most beautiful speech she had ever heard, because it was made of the same substance as their lives' work: shelter, partnership, and a simple, profound honesty. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the golden light of the lanterns into a shimmering halo around him. She looked from the ring to his earnest, hopeful face. A slow smile spread across her own lips, a smile that was full of the wit and resilience that was so deeply a part of her. "I accept," she said, her voice a little shaky but full of a deep, resonant joy, "as long as you do not intend to measure my ring finger with a soup ladle." A great, booming laugh escaped him, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, and then he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight against the solid warmth of his chest. He buried his face in her hair, and she could feel the thrum of his heart against her own. "You know," he murmured into her ear, his voice a warm whisper against the cool night air, "you really do fit my arms just right." And as she leaned into his embrace, she finally, completely believed him. Their wedding was not a grand affair. It was held a few days later, on the porch of the new diner. There was no preacher, only Judge Harrison, who had come out from town to wish them well. There was no white dress, only Nora's best calico, and the new apron the men had given her. There was no wedding cake. Instead, Nora brought out a large, perfectly browned loaf of her sourdough bread, the same bread that had sustained them and brought them together. Eli took out his sharpest cattleman's knife, and together they made the first cut. Tiva was there, and she blessed their union not with prayers, but with a scattering of fragrant sage, its clean, sharp scent mingling with the smell of the new pine and the fresh bread. The men of Coyote Ridge, their hats in their hands, stood as witnesses, and on the new diner door, a sign, clumsily lettered by young Lem, had been posted. It read, "No one eats alone." The Iron Pot and Gentle Heart opened its doors the following week, and the whole of Dry Willow, it seemed, came to see it. Men who had once jeered at Nora in the stockyards now sat at her counter, their hats on their knees, and ordered bowls of her beef stew. They ate in a respectful silence, and when they were finished, they paid their bills in full, leaving a few extra coins on the counter. A few of the townswomen, their faces full of a new, curious respect, asked if she might be willing to share her recipe for biscuits. The diner was not just a place to eat, it was a new heart for the community, a place of reconciliation and quiet grace. A month later, the railroad officially opened the new siding, just as Eli had predicted. The work crews, tired and hungry, descended on the diner. Their arrival brought a steady, reliable stream of income that, combined with the profits from the ranch, began to make a serious dent in the loan from the Cheyenne Bank. Their future, once a precarious day-to-day struggle, was becoming a solid, well-built thing. One afternoon, Nora stood behind her new counter, polishing a glass. The diner was quiet, the lull between the midday rush and the evening meal. The autumn sun streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the motes of flour that always seemed to dance in the air. On a special shelf behind the counter, in a place of honor, sat her old, cracked earthenware crock, the one that held her sourdough starter. She had built a small glass-fronted cabinet for it, like a shrine. A small, hand-lettered sign beside it read, "Needs to be fed daily." Outside, her storm lantern hung from its hook, its glass clean, its wick trimmed, ready for the night. It was a permanent fixture now, a promise of light and welcome that would not be extinguished. She looked around at the strong, clean lines of her kitchen, at the sturdy tables and chairs, at the warm, welcoming space she and Eli had built together. She thought of the long, hard road that had brought her here. Love, she had learned, was not a lightning strike. It was a slow fire, patiently tended. Dignity was not a thing that was given, but a thing that was earned through the steady, often invisible, labor of care. And the worth of a person, she now knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, was not measured by the space they occupied in the world, but by the way they fit into the arms of someone who loved them. The kitchen was warm, and the wind outside was no longer a threat, and here, in this place, with a solid roof over her head and a future she was building with her own 2 hands. No one ever had to feel like they were too much again. A story, if it is to have any truth in it, must be about more than just a man and a woman meeting on a dusty plain. It must be about the landscape of the human heart, which is often a territory just as wild and unforgiving as any piece of land in Wyoming. The tale of Nora Daly and Eli Cutter is, at its core, a story about the quiet, stubborn refusal to be diminished. It is a testament to the idea that a person's dignity is not measured by the space they fill in a room, but by the integrity with which they fill their own life. In a world that so often values the superficial, their story stands as a quiet defense of substance, a belief that the steady, often unseen labor of caring for others is the very bedrock upon which a true community is built. Their love was not a flash flood, but a slow-rising spring, a thing that grew not from a single, grand declaration, but from the patient, daily repetition of small kindnesses, a shared burden, a mended glove, a plate of food kept warm by the fire. Every life is shaped by the conflicts it must endure, and Nora's was a battle fought on many fronts. The most profound struggle was the one within her own soul, the journey from a defensive crouch, waiting for the world's judgment, to standing tall and choosing to define herself by her own measure. She had to learn that her worth was not something to be granted by others, but something to be claimed by her own 2 hands. This internal war was mirrored in the world around her. She faced the casual cruelty of men like Silas and the calculated, venomous ambition of a woman like Prudence Vale, who saw people as assets or obstacles on a social ledger. These personal skirmishes were but a small part of a larger societal conflict, a struggle against a system where power, held by the bank and a corrupt sheriff, was used as a weapon to enforce a brutal code of conformity and greed. And beneath it all was the oldest conflict of all the struggle against nature itself. The biting wind, the punishing hail, the sudden violent flood, and the insidious sickness that crept from the poisoned earth, these were not mere backdrops to the human drama. They were crucibles, forces that stripped away pretense and revealed the true character of those who faced them, forcing the small, fragile community to either fracture under the pressure or forge a bond stronger than steel. In the face of such trials, people change. They must. Nora began her journey as a woman who had built a fortress around her heart. A fortress of skill and competence designed to protect her from a world that had told her she was too much. But through the alchemy of her own courage, she transformed from a defender into a builder. A woman who did not just create meals, but created a home. She learned that being respected for her skill was only the foundation. The house itself was built when she finally allowed herself to believe she was worthy of love. Eli, too, underwent a profound transformation. He started as a man locked in a silent, solitary struggle against debt and despair, his voice as quiet as the vast, empty plains. But Nora's steadfastness, her refusal to break, became the catalyst for his own evolution. He found his voice not in anger, but in a quiet, unshakable defense of what was right. He became a leader not by command, but by the simple, powerful act of standing beside the woman he loved and declaring her worth to the world, and the community itself. The chorus of ranchers and townspeople who had begun as mockers was transformed by their example. They were shamed not by accusations, but by their own conscience, and they learned, slowly and grudgingly at first, to replace their ridicule with a gratitude that ultimately blossomed into a true and lasting respect. Every story leaves behind echoes, images that linger in the mind long after the final page is turned. In this tale, it is the simple, earthy symbols that hold the deepest meaning. The humble crock of sourdough starter, a living inheritance, was the story's beating heart, a tangible representation of a faith that must be nourished every single day to survive and to provide sustenance for others. Nora's storm lantern, hanging by the cookhouse door, became more than just a light. It was a beacon of persistent hope, a promise that even in the darkest, windiest nights, there was a place of welcome, a sanctuary that would not be extinguished by rumor or malice. The piece of braided rawhide Eli gave her was the story's central metaphor, a thing both soft and strong, flexible enough to yield but too tough to break, a perfect symbol for Nora's own spirit and for the resilient, interwoven bond that grew between them. And finally, there was the simple wash basin, the site of a quiet, nightly ritual. It was here that their partnership was truly forged, in the shared, unglamorous work of cleaning up at the end of a long day. A place where equality and respect were not abstract concepts, but a simple, practical reality. The telling of such a story requires a certain rhythm, a pace that mirrors the ebb and flow of life itself. The narrative was driven by moments of sudden, heart-pounding action, the chaos of the hailstorm, the desperate rescue during the flash flood, the tense, public confrontation in the heart of Dry Willow. But these moments of crisis were always balanced by the slow, warm passages of healing and connection. The quiet hours spent in the kitchen, the shared silence by the fire, the meticulous act of writing down a recipe for the future. The story was built not just on what the characters did, but on the tangible, sensory world they inhabited: the gritty taste of dust, the sharp, clean scent of sage, the rich, life-affirming smell of baking bread. This was a world to be felt, not just observed. The plot itself followed a clean, strong line, a journey from a single kitchen to a sickness that threatened the entire community, and finally, to a public reckoning that delivered a hard-won justice. The initial sting of mockery at the cattle auction was the inciting wound. The quiet confession in the lantern light was the story's pivotal turning point, and the climactic unmasking of Rusk and Prudence was the moment the community's fever finally broke, allowing true healing to begin. Ultimately, the hope is that a reader leaves this story with a feeling of warmth, a sense of having been seen. The moral is not a loud, preachy thing, but a quiet truth discovered along the way that the measure of a society is in how it treats those who are most easily ridiculed, and that true justice, often arrives not with a sword, but with a bowl of hot stew and a steady, unwavering belief in the decency of others. The world of Coyote Ridge was grounded in the realities of the American West in the latter part of the 19th century, the hard economics of ranching, the ever-present threat of rustlers, the absolute power of a local sheriff, the disruptive force of the coming railroad, and the vital, often overlooked, wisdom of the native communities who knew the land far better than the newcomers. It was a world of hardship and struggle, but it was not a world without hope. For when the kitchen is warm, the wind outside is less fierce, and between two arms that fit just right, no one ever feels like they are too much again. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.